In this video, I'm going to teach you 80% of the basics of photography in just 10 minutes. These are the technical principles of how to use your camera, and hopefully by learning this, you'll be inspired to dive into all the other wonderful skills about learning photography because there's so much to learn. This video is the very first video on my new series called Beginner's Guide 2, which is a new series teaching creative skills for the new content creator. And if you're a beginner photographer really wanting to fast track your development when it comes to skills, then check out my 30-day photography fundamentals course, which I will leave a link to in the description box below. So photography is all about the control and the management of light. And we measure that light in what's called stops of light. Now, to control these stops of light in our images, we use a concept called the exposure triangle. Now, the exposure triangle has three main components: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. All three of these components have different technical ways of changing how much light is in our image, but they all share the same thing in common in that they all control stops of light that we have in our image, so they share a common language. Now, let's talk about the first component of the exposure triangle, shutter speed. And when we take a photo, light comes through the end of the lens, hits the shutter, and then hits the sensor. The shutter is the thing in front of the sensor that opens and allows the light to come through onto the sensor, and then it closes, making our exposure. And the faster the shutter speed you have, the faster that shutter opens and then closes. And this means that less light is able to make its way onto the sensor because it's open for less time. Now, the slower shutter speed you have, the longer the shutter is open for, and the more light is then able to make its way onto the sensor. Now, creatively, the way to think about shutter speed is to think about whether or not you want to freeze the action in your image or whether you want your image to be blurry. To freeze the action, which is going to be most of the time, especially if you're shooting, street or portraits or sport or wildlife, etc., you want a faster shutter speed typically. So, 1/250, 1/400, 1/800, 1/1600, and so on. When it comes to freezing the action, there's no such thing as too fast of a shutter speed. Now, if you have a tripod to rest your camera on, then you might be doing night photography or landscapes, and you might use slower shutter speeds such as 1 second, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 8 seconds, or more. Now, all of these denominations are actually one stop of light difference between each other. And for shutter speed, this is how we talk about it in time. One common mistake that people make when they first start out with photography is that they complain that their images just aren't sharp. And most of the time, that isn't because they don't have good gear. Most cameras are actually pretty good nowadays. But actually, it's because they don't have a fast enough shutter speed and they're introducing micro jitters and therefore blur into their images. Check out this video I made here if you want to ensure that your images are absolutely tack sharp every single time. The second component of the exposure triangle is called aperture. The aperture refers to the size of the opening at the end of the lens. The larger this iris, the more light comes through. The smaller the iris, the less light comes through. For aperture, we refer to stops of light that it produces as what's called f-stops. The closer to 0 that number, the larger the aperture will be. The larger the number, the smaller the aperture will be. So common aperture stops look like f1.4, f2, f2.8, f4, f5.6, f8, f11, f16, and so on. And for example, lenses that have a maximum aperture of f1.4 will have a very large aperture, like this one. Now, creatively, aperture is most commonly associated with controlling what's called the depth of field. Simply put, depth of field refers to how much of the image can be in focus. So large apertures like f1.4 will produce what's called a very shallow depth of field. This means that the area of focus is quite thin or is quite shallow, and it's typically used to draw your eye into the thing that's the most important thing in the composition while the rest of the image goes out of focus. And this out of focus blur is commonly known as bokeh, and many people find it to be very aesthetically pleasing. These effects are very often found in genres such as portrait or fashion photography. Now, on the opposite end, if you do landscapes or architecture, for example, you'll probably want a much deeper depth of field. So you would use smaller apertures such as f5.6, f8, f11, so that you can get everything in focus. Now, depth of field can get really detailed and complicated because it has many other factors such as subject distance, focal length, and so on, but this is definitely enough to get you started. Just remember, if you want less things in focus but more available light, then a lower f-stop number like f1.4 will do the trick. If you want more things in focus but less available light, then a higher f-stop number like f11 will do the trick. Okay, if you're enjoying this video so far, I would really appreciate it if you would hit that like button for me so that I know it's good enough to make even more free videos like this in the future. And the last component of the exposure triangle is ISO. So ISO refers to the amount of gain the image has. So think of it like giving the sensor more power to brighten up the image if need be. Common stops of ISO are ISO 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400, and so on. Now, ISO doesn't have an implicit creative effect on our images like shutter speed or aperture have, and so it should also be treated in that way. With ISO, the more you increase it, the brighter your image becomes, but also the more noise or visual artifacts you introduce as well. You also end up decreasing dynamic range and color as well, but that's a very advanced topic for perhaps another time. Ideally, you want to have as low of an ISO setting as possible, so long as your other two settings are correct first. One very common mistake that beginners make is that they think ISO and noise is a huge deal, so they keep it really low at the sake of getting their shutter speed or their aperture incorrect. And this is a mistake. Messing up your shutter speed or your aperture means that you may get an unintentionally blurry image, and you can never unblur a blurry shot, but you can remove noise from a noisy shot. And because of this, think of ISO last when it comes to setting up your shots. And that leads me to bringing all of this together. So when I'm approaching a scene I want to take a photo of, I'll always think about doing it in this order. First, I will think about whether or not I want my subject in my image to be blurry or be frozen. 99% of the time, it's going to be frozen, so that's my decision made for me. And I'll adjust my shutter speed according to that scene. And usually I will go a little bit faster than I think I'll need just to be on the safe side. Then I'll think about depth of field. Do I want many things to be in focus, or do I just want one thing to be in focus? And usually this change will happen depending on what I'm shooting, like whether or not it's a landscape or it's a portrait, or if I have a subject in the foreground and so on. Most of the time, I actually shoot as large as I can get in terms of aperture because I like to have as much light gathering as possible. And I'm either using prime lenses for portraits or I'm shooting things very far away with landscapes. And then lastly, I'll look at the image and I'll adjust the ISO accordingly. A tip here, if your camera has it, is to use the auto ISO function and have your ISO set in a bracket so that you don't even need to think about it and you can let your camera handle it all. Now, what do you do if the image is either too bright or too dark? Now, if the image is too dark, you need more light. So usually I will have my shutter speed and aperture dialed in based on my creative intention, which means all I need to do is just turn my ISO up until I get the exposure I want. If the image is too bright, however, and my aperture is locked in from a creative standpoint, and my ISO is already at the lowest that it can go, then I'll actually adjust my shutter speed to go even faster. Because remember, if you're freezing the action, there's no such thing as too fast of a shutter speed. Okay, and that's the technical basics of photography. Of course, we're just scratching the surface here really, but when it comes to the beginner basics, these are the basic rules to follow. And over time, you'll be able to deeply understand them and see where you can stretch and bend these rules, as I'm sure some of you people in the comments are going to point out. But these are the rules that I teach to all of my beginners, and I think that they're a great place to start. And again, if you want to learn the rest of the photography basics, then check out my 30-day photography fundamentals course where I talk about focus and shooting modes and light and gear and all of that other good stuff. Or if you want to learn about vision and the more creative side of photography, then check out my visual patterns playlist for some free videos about that over there. Otherwise, stay tuned for the next videos on this Beginner's Guide to series, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.